You think you know Queen Elizabeth I, the glorious Virgin Queen, the one who reigned for 45 years, who stood unshaken before the Spanish Armada and carved her name into the golden age of England. That's the story they tell in textbooks. But peel back the powdered mask, tear away the polished portraits, and what you'll find is not a saint in silk, but a woman who ruled by fear, obsession, and silence so deep it still echoes centuries later. Elizabeth I didn't just wear the crown, she became it. In her world, there was no room for the soft edges of love, no space for weakness, and certainly no mercy for those who stepped out of line. Her palace wasn't a place of grace. It was a trap made of eyes and whispers, where spies reported every glance, every smile, every breath that lingered too long near the wrong person. Beneath the lace collars and velvet gowns, her court pulsed with dread. Behind every curtsy was a hidden terror. Would today be the day the Queen turned on you? She outlawed love not by decree, but by example. She never married, but not out of virtue. This was not a woman who sacrificed for country. This was a queen who turned romance into a prison sentence. When one of her most loyal ladies, Bess Throckmorton, dared to marry the explorer Walter Raleigh in secret, Elizabeth did not scold her. She did not strip her of titles. No, she threw them both into the Tower of London. Bess was pregnant. It did not matter. Loyalty to Elizabeth was not a bond. It was ownership. And love was betrayal. But that was only one of her rules. Her second was even stranger. Even darker. Elizabeth made her own face illegal. After surviving smallpox at the age of 29, her skin was ravaged by pockmarks and scars. But in an age where beauty equaled divine favor, she could not be seen as damaged. So she created what historians now call face patterns, official government templates that dictated exactly how her portrait was to be painted. No artist could show the real queen. They could only show the mask. And what a mask! It was thick white paste made of lead and vinegar, called Venetian ceruse, slathered daily over her skin until it ate through flesh and bone. She poisoned herself in the name of beauty and forced the women around her to do the same. And yet it still gets worse. Elizabeth's third rule was the most insidious. She created a kingdom where surveillance was not just political, it was romantic. Every whisper was watched. Every glance could be reported. Every conversation between man and woman might be the beginning of a crime. Her ladies-in-waiting were kept under such scrutiny that many suffered breakdowns, losing sleep and health in fear of a misplaced smile. Elizabeth, in herself, a product of betrayal. Her mother, Anne Boleyn, executed by her father, seemed determined to make everyone else live inside the same paranoia that shaped her. Then there was religion, her fourth rule. People liked to believe Elizabeth was a moderate, a unifier between Protestant and Catholic. That is the myth, the truth. She ruled religion with an iron fist disguised in holy silk. The Church of England was her creation. Yes, but dissent was punishable not by prayer, but by death. Over 200 Catholics were executed during her reign. But she never called it martyrdom. She called it treason. That was her trick. Spiritual terror, cloaked in political language. You could believe whatever you wanted in your heart so long as your mouth said what the Queen commanded. Private prayer was watched. Church attendance was mandatory. And your own children could be the ones to turn you in. But perhaps the most haunting of all her rules was the last, the absolute denial of weakness. Elizabeth did not age. Not publicly. She did not fall ill. She did not weep. Even as her body broke down. Even as her hair fell out in clumps. Even as her teeth blackened and dropped from her gums. She painted herself into a fantasy. She wore wigs so tall they scraped the ceilings. Gowns so stiff They held her upright when her spine could not. She stuffed her cheeks with cloth to simulate youth. Ambassadors were terrified of the strange puppet before them, a queen who refused to decay. But she was rotting, inside and out. And still, she refused to name an heir. As her health failed, the country stood on a knife's edge. Civil war loomed. Yet Elizabeth would not speak the name of a successor. To do so would be to admit she would one day die. And Elizabeth did not not in her mind. She ruled until the very edge of life, held together by costume and silence. When she finally passed, she left behind no child, no guidance, no peace, only a court riddled with fear, and a legacy rewritten in gold to hide the mold underneath. So here she is, the queen they called glorious. But look again, closely. Do you see the cracks in the paint, the bruises beneath the silk, the terror in the eyes of those around her? Elizabeth I wasn't just a monarch. She was a myth built on fear. A woman who chose masks over mirrors, command over connection, and performance over truth. And in doing so, she didn't just rule England. She haunted it. You were taught she was a symbol of strength. But maybe, just maybe, she was the loneliest prisoner in her own kingdom. They called her the Virgin Queen. But virginity was never the point. It was power. Elizabeth I wore her chastity like armor, a gleaming lie forged in childhood trauma and political necessity. Behind it, she built not a court of elegance and grace, but a fortress of emotional starvation, where love itself became treason and marriage was punished like high betrayal. Her crown was not a symbol of divine right, it was a warning. And those who forgot it, even for a moment, paid in blood, in freedom, or in the quiet collapse of everything they once believed safe. The story of Bess Throckmorton and Walter Raleigh is one often told as scandal, but rarely with the silence. It deserves the silence of stone walls, of babies growing inside prisons, of friendships shattered at the edge of a royal glare. Bess had served Elizabeth loyally for years. One of the Queen's closest ladies in waiting, trusted to dress her, watch over her, whisper with her behind closed doors. And Walter Raleigh was no stranger to favour either. A dashing explorer, a man of ambition and flattery. He had danced in and out of Elizabeth's graces, like a court jester balancing on a sword. But when the two fell in love, and dared to marry in secret in the year 1591, it wasn't jealousy that cracked Elizabeth's composure. It was the unforgivable illusion that someone else could choose happiness without her permission. The punishment came swift, and without mercy. Both Bess and Raleigh were arrested. She, heavy with child, was forced into the Tower of London, a freezing, rat-infested cell that had already swallowed countless souls before her. No regard was given to her condition, no exception made for years of loyalty. For Elizabeth, it wasn't about the marriage, it was about the message. To fall in love without the Queen's blessing was to declare yourself sovereign in your own heart. And in Elizabeth's world, there could be only one sovereign. Bess spent months in that tower, separated from her husband, with no guarantee she would ever be free again. She gave birth in confinement, uncertain if the child would ever live to see sunlight. Outside the stone walls, Elizabeth continued her royal routine, hosting ambassadors, attending services, commanding the theatre of monarchy, while a woman who had once held her mirror now sat in darkness, exiled for a single act of human tenderness. When the Queen finally relented and allowed their release, it was not forgiveness. It was exile in disguise. Bess was permanently banished from court, her name erased from favour. Raleigh, ever the charmer, would claw his way back into the Queen's graces over time. But Bess remained a ghost unseen, unspoken, and never pardoned. Her crime had not been deceit. It had not been disrespect. It had been love. And in Elizabeth's court, love was a dangerous, uncontrollable wildfire. It had to be extinguished before it spread. This was not an isolated cruelty. It was a pattern repeated in whispers throughout the palace. Ladies in waiting learned to smile with caution, to look away when a gentleman approached, to suffocate their affections before they bloomed. The Queen might reward you with jewels one day and ice you out the next. Not for what you did, but for what she imagined you might feel. The line between friendship and betrayal was never fixed. It moved with her mood, with her memory, with the ghosts of her own history. Because beneath all this control, all this surveillance, all this emotional tyranny, was a story of a girl who had watched her mother die in Boulogne, accused of adultery and incest, beheaded before her daughter was even 3 years old. The memory may not have been visual, but its shadow stretched across Elizabeth's entire life. Every woman who dared to love became a reflection of her mother, beautiful, disobedient, and doomed. And so the Queen built a new reality, where such mistakes could not be repeated. If she could not erase the past, she could at least prevent its echo. Elizabeth spoke often of being married to England, a clever phrase that covered the raw truth. She had no place for intimacy. She could command armies, navigate foreign alliances, and manipulate Parliament with brilliance. But in the private rooms of her court, she was a tyrant of the heart. She created an environment where vulnerability was lethal and affection was a liability. Even flirtation was dangerous. A shared glance, a too long conversation, a secret letter. These became grounds for investigation, for removal, for ruin. Men and women alike learned to perform loyalty like actors in a play they didn't write. Their real selves were buried beneath protocol and fear, their desires repressed until they curdled into paranoia or madness. Some whispered that the Queen encouraged flirtations only to punish them later, that she took pleasure in pulling strings, in watching lovers crumble under the weight of her disapproval. Others simply kept quiet, because quietness was the only shield that worked. It wasn't just Bess Throckmorton. Lettice Knollys made the same mistake marrying Robert Dudley, the man many believed to be the great love of Elizabeth's life. The rage that followed was biblical. Lettice was exiled permanently, and years later, when the Queen encountered her again, she struck her across the face in public. That wasn't a monarch, it was a wounded child, lashing out at a mirror. And still, the court went on. The dances, the banquets, the performances of grandeur, all performed beneath a ceiling of silence. Every laugh was measured, every word rehearsed. The women who served the Queen walked a razor's edge between favour and destruction. Some endured, some faded. A few broke entirely, their spirits crushed by the impossibility of pleasing a ruler who demanded love from all but gave it to none. What makes Elizabeth's war on love so chilling is not its cruelty, but its logic. In her mind, every marriage was a threat. Every bond between two people that did not include her was a weakening of her control. By eliminating love, she centralized devotion. By criminalizing marriage, she ensured no one's allegiance was divided. She became the sole object of affection in her kingdom, not through charisma, but through coercion. History paints her as triumphant, a woman who outmaneuvered kings, who never bowed, who left behind a legacy of power and peace. But in the chambers of her palace, in the hearts of those who served her, she was not a legend. She was a presence, a haunting, unrelenting force that watched your every move and punished you for the most human of acts. There is no monument to the women she destroyed, no plaque for Bess, no statue for Lettice, no candle for the unnamed ones who swallowed their feelings and learned to smile with frozen lips. But they were real, and they suffered, Elizabeth I ruled with intellect. Yes. With willpower? Absolutely. But also with loneliness weaponized and sharpened until it cut through every tie that could have made her reign more human. In making herself untouchable, she made herself unreachable. And in banning love, she ensured no one could ever truly betray her, because no one was ever truly allowed to care. And so, the Virgin Queen reigned not above her people, but apart from them, alone, untouched, unloved, by choice, by fear, by the iron logic of a heart that refused to break, even as it shattered every other one around it. Each morning before the court awakened, before the sun slipped through the high glass windows of the royal bedchamber, Elizabeth I began her transformation, not from woman to queen, but from mortal to myth. She did not wake and rise like others. She was assembled, piece by piece, layer by layer, with trembling hands and silent servants. She crafted a mask of divinity, designed not to protect her, but to hide her. It began with the skin. Beneath the ceremonial makeup was not porcelain, but pockmarked flesh scars, carved by smallpox in the year 1562. When Elizabeth was 29 years old, the disease nearly claimed her life. But it took something greater, her face. And in a court obsessed with beauty, where monarchs were believed to be chosen by God himself, the loss of that face was more than a personal injury. It was a political crisis. So she hid, not behind veils or shadows, but behind poison. Venetian ceruse was the name of her salvation and her slow execution, a mixture of white lead and vinegar. It created the illusion of smooth, parley perfection, but it came with a price. It burned the skin, caused hair to fall out in clumps, destroyed tissue beneath the surface. And yet Elizabeth wore it daily, not just to cover her scars, but to bury them beneath powder, beneath myth, beneath layers of denial so thick they would one day be indistinguishable from madness. But she did not suffer alone. She demanded that her ladies suffer with her. In her court, beauty was not optional, it was a performance, a ritual, a uniform. Women who served her were expected to emulate her look, the white paste, the rouged cheeks, the red lips shaped like a bow drawn in blood. The damage did not matter. If the queen wore poison, so would her court. And so the palace became a place not of flowers and silks, but of lead dust and dying skin. The mirrors, once places of vanity, became altars of endurance. No one dared speak of the decay. It would be treason to suggest the queen's beauty was not divine. To hint at the truth that the woman beneath the crown was crumbling was to gamble your life on the edge of her pride. So they bowed. They smiled. They obeyed. And slowly, they disintegrated. By the later years of her reign, Elizabeth's face was not simply painted, it was sculpted. The lead paste had to be applied thicker each day to conceal the growing damage underneath. It cracked when she smiled. It peeled when she cried. Servants would sometimes find streaks of blood on her pillow, where the toxic makeup had mixed with open sores during the night. But still, the next morning, the ritual resumed, and the wigs, dozens, then hundreds, stored in drawers, on stands, arranged by color and style. After years of lead exposure, Elizabeth's hair had thinned to near nothingness. But that, too, could not be admitted. She had wigs in shades of auburn and fire red, each one designed to evoke youth and strength. Some were so tall they needed pins and scaffolding beneath. Some were so heavy that she could barely hold her head upright. Yet she wore them all, even when they caused migraines, even when they pulled at her remaining hair with every movement. Pain was nothing. Illusion was everything. She could no longer look in mirrors without servants present. And when portraits were commissioned, she controlled every aspect. No artist could paint her as she appeared. Instead, they were handed official templates, face patterns that instructed how to depict the queen. The nose must be straight, the skin must be flawless, the eyes must reflect majesty. To deviate from this standard was to risk disgrace. Or worse, artists became copyists. Painters became propagandists. The result was a series of portraits that, over the decades, ceased to age, even as the Queen did. In one, she stands beside a globe, untouched by time. In another, she appears in armor, ageless, fearless. The paintings became not just lies, they became weapons, used to convince her enemies that England was ruled by a god-woman who could not die, who did not bleed, who would never weaken. The mask did not only hide her decay, it projected invincibility. But inside the mask lived a woman falling apart. Visitors described her with polite restraint. Ambassadors from Spain and France noted her odd stiffness, the way her speech sometimes slurred, how her smile never quite reached her eyes. Rumors spread of blackened teeth, of breath laced with rot, of sudden mood swings and trembling hands. But no one said these things aloud in her presence. To speak the truth was to vanish from court. To serve the Queen was to lie with grace. And then there was the smile. By the end, Elizabeth had lost many of her teeth, some from age, others from lead poisoning, still more from the primitive dental practices of the day. To maintain the illusion of fullness, she stuffed cloth into her cheeks before public appearances. The result was a face that looked smooth from afar but up close, twisted and artificial. Foreign dignitaries described feeling unnerved in her presence, unable to reconcile the woman before them with the image in her portraits. She had become a painting come to life, but not in the way they expected. Those close to her feared her more than they loved her. Even her most trusted servants were never safe. She could turn cold in an instant, lash out at perceived slights, retreat into silence without warning. Her vanity was not mere arrogance. It was the armor of someone who had been judged by the world since she was a child. Someone who had watched her mother be executed for failing to play her role correctly. Someone who had learned that to show weakness was to die. And so, she wore the mask. Not for beauty, not even for power, but because she believed, in the hollow of her bones, that the mask was all that kept her alive. The court played along. They had to. And in doing so, they participated in one of the greatest deceptions of the age, not of politics, not of war, but of identity. They helped build a myth that still survives today, the Virgin Queen, the eternal monarch, the goddess in human form. But they also watched a woman disintegrate before their eyes. And they said nothing. It is easy to admire Elizabeth for her strength. She ruled alone. She held a fractious kingdom together. She defied popes, kings, and assassins. But beneath that steel exterior was a body ravaged by poison, a heart locked away in grief, and a mind slowly consumed by the very image she had created. She became what the world demanded at the cost of everything she truly was. By the time she died in the year 1603, she was no longer a woman. She was a relic of her own creation. Her last days were spent in silence, seated on cushions, unable to sleep, unable to speak, surrounded by shadows and ghosts. She refused to go to bed. She refused to be undressed. She refused to face the mirror, because she knew the mask had cracked. The lie could no longer hold, and without it, there was nothing left. Not queen, not woman, only silence. There were no safe corners in Elizabeth I's court, no place to hide a glance, no moment too small to escape. Notice, Within the honeycomb chambers of Whitehall and Richmond, even love was subject to the law, though unwritten, though unspoken. The rule was simple: no affection without the Queen. And if your heart dared to beat too loudly for someone else, it would be torn from you, not by executioner's blade, but by exile, disgrace, and a silence that followed you like your own shadow. The Queen did not need a confession. She did not need proof. A rumour was enough. A whisper in the wrong corridor. A pause too long at a dance. A letter that arrived too late to be explained. And suddenly, you were gone, vanished from court. Stripped of titles, friends, and the future you once imagined. That was how romance ended in the reign of the Virgin Queen, not with wedding bells, but with closed doors and lowered eyes. She had spies. That much is known, but they weren't just agents of the crown in the traditional sense. They were ladies themselves, gentlemen of the chamber, even the servants who scrubbed the flagstones. Their loyalty was not always to the law, but to her. And in a world where a single raised eyebrow could determine one's fate, loyalty to the Queen often meant betrayal of everyone else. The women of her court, those polished, perfumed satellites that orbited her daily, lived under a gaze sharper than any sword. They were not merely her attendants. They were a reflection of her own femininity, her own power, her own aging beauty. And so they had to be perfect. They had to be still. They had to be devoted. But above all, they had to be alone. Their hearts belonged to her, or they belonged nowhere. Romantic attachment, even the most innocent, was treated with suspicion. A smile from the wrong man, a laugh that echoed too brightly, a letter tucked into a sleeve. These were not harmless. These were warning signs that your loyalty was cracking, that your body was present, but your heart was drifting. And Elizabeth did not tolerate drift. She had seen what drift could do. She had watched it destroy her mother. She had watched it ruin queens before her. She would not let it infect her court. This paranoia did not come from nowhere. Elizabeth was not born cruel. She was made cruel by blood, by betrayal, by the sharp memory of her mother's final days. She was only 2 years old when Anne Boleyn was beheaded. But a child does not need words to understand what it means when love leads to death. Her father, Henry VIII, had loved her mother until he didn't. And then Anne's head rolled in the Tower courtyard while Elizabeth was kept in distant silence. Love, to Elizabeth, was a knife waiting to fall, and so she wielded it first. There was a pattern to her cruelty, and it often masqueraded as favour. First, she would draw a lady close, shower her with gifts, praise her intelligence, praise her beauty, make her feel seen, make her feel chosen. And then, at the first sign of independence, a flirtation, a marriage proposal, even a blush, she would turn. The warmth would vanish, the rooms would grow colder, the eyes that once watched with approval now narrowed with suspicion, and the fall from favour was never quiet. It was public. It was deliberate. It was a warning to every other woman who still clung to the illusion of friendship. Consider Lettice Knollys, a cousin of the Queen,
and
a woman who,
fallen quiet.
by birth, by beauty, by behaviour, might have lived her entire life in Elizabeth's good graces. But Lettice committed the unpardonable sin. She married Robert Dudley, Elizabeth's favourite, the man many believed to be the great secret love of her life. The marriage was done in secret, of course, as all dangerous things are, but secrets rarely stay buried in royal courts. And when Elizabeth found out, she did not scream, she did not weep, she banished Lettice from court, forever. Years later, when their paths crossed again, the Queen struck her, in public, with a force not of muscle but of memory. That slap was not just for Lettice. It was for Anne. It was for Henry. It was for every woman who had ever dared to love freely and paid the price for it. But it wasn't only the women who suffered. The men, too, learned to tread carefully. A courtier who smiled too often at the wrong lady found himself reassigned, or ignored, or worse, watched. And the queen, who encouraged flattery like a hungry flame, would often stoke romantic tension between her courtiers, only to extinguish it cruelly when it threatened to burn without her permission. She was the producer of a never-ending play in which everyone auditioned for her attention. But none were allowed to perform without her script. There were no weddings in her court without her blessing. And those who sought her blessing often learned that the price was too high. She would delay. She would demand proofs of loyalty. She would invent offences. She would pretend to consider. And all the while, time passed. Suitors aged. Ladies waited. And in the end, most were left with nothing but the ghost of a future that never came. But the most insidious thing she did, the thing that no title, no portrait, no monument ever records, is that she taught her people to police themselves. Her ladies learned to report on one another, not because they were cruel, but because they were afraid. They knew what happened to women who kept secrets. They knew what happened to those who stayed silent. And so they spoke. They whispered. They warned, not to destroy but to survive. And in this way, Elizabeth created a court where surveillance was not an act of state, but a way of life. It was not just the eyes of the Queen that watched. It was the eyes of your friends, your rivals, your own reflection. Every action weighed, every word rehearsed. Even love, the most spontaneous and reckless of human experiences, was forced into cages and rituals. No one trusted anyone. And when trust dies, affection follows. In Elizabeth's palace, even the act of caring became dangerous. Some broke under the pressure. There are records buried in letters, in court complaints, in the margins of diaries of women who suffered nervous collapse, who wept in corners, who begged for release. One lady, unnamed in the surviving pages, was described as wandering the gallery in silence, pale and uncomposed, as though haunted by invisible hands. No one wrote what had happened to her. No one needed to. Everyone understood. She had loved. She had hoped. She had been seen, and now she was gone. Elizabeth ruled with fear, but not the fear of armies or punishments. It was the fear of being noticed, of being chosen, of being next. This was not politics. This was not even monarchy. This was emotional tyranny at the highest level. A kingdom where the crime was not treason but tenderness, and the punishment was not death but absence. The cold exile of the forgotten, the permanent silence that came when the Queen no longer looked your way. They called her the Virgin Queen. But the word virgin never meant untouched. It meant untouchable, and she made sure of that. By building a palace with no love, Elizabeth made herself the only object of devotion. She did not allow others to find comfort in each other, and so every heart turned toward her, not in passion, but in survival, not in admiration, but in necessity. And that, perhaps, was her greatest triumph, or her deepest wound. Elizabeth I did not just rule over bodies. She ruled over beliefs. She did not care what people whispered in their sleep or feared when they closed their eyes. What she demanded, what she required, was control over the words they spoke aloud, the prayers they mouthed in church, the posture of their public faith. In her kingdom, religion was not a choice. It was choreography. It was theatre. And those who refused to perform their parts to her liking found themselves stripped not only of property and safety, but of identity itself. The world outside her court often described Elizabeth as a moderate, a careful bridge between the extremes of her father's Protestant violence and her sister Mary's Catholic fires. But those who lived within the breath of her reign knew otherwise. There was nothing moderate about her need to dictate how a soul expressed devotion. She did not seek unity, she sought uniformity. She did not care about sincerity, only submission. And so, the Church of England under Elizabeth became a mirror of her own reflection, rigid, polished, and absolutely intolerant of deviation. She made herself the supreme governor of the Church, an unprecedented title, one that merged divine and political power in a single crown. It was not enough to rule men. She had to rule their salvation too. To question her decrees was to question both church and throne. Heresy and treason became indistinguishable. The penalty was the same. But Elizabeth understood that violence was not always the most effective tool. Terror could be applied gently, through the slow crush of fines and public shame. Catholics who refused to attend the new Protestant services were punished not always by execution, but by financial destruction. The recusancy laws imposed ruinous penalties. Entire families were reduced to poverty for missing church. Estates were seized, homes lost, children sent away. One act of refusal was enough to begin the unraveling. And still, many resisted. Secret masses were held in cellars. Priests smuggled in from the continent, hid behind panels in the walls of country homes. Children were baptized in whispers. The rosary passed from hand to trembling hand, as if it carried not salvation, but a death sentence. Because it did. Elizabeth's spies did not limit themselves to the affairs of courtiers and lovers. They moved through towns, villages, parishes. Neighbors reported neighbors. Servants betrayed employers. Even children raised in fear were encouraged to speak against their parents if they heard forbidden prayers. And the Queen rewarded these confessions. Not with mercy, but with validation. The system she created was not just about catching the disloyal, it was about creating them, turning trust into a liability, making fear the only safe language. She executed over 200 Catholics during her reign. But she was careful, always careful, to say it was not for their faith. It was for their treason. That was the script. They were not martyrs. She insisted. They were enemies of the state. And thus, the executions were justified, but the people knew. The blood that soaked the scaffold steps was not spilled over politics. It was spilled over prayers. The cruelty did not end with the Catholics. The Puritans, too, felt her wrath. Those Protestants who sought to take reform further, who wanted a stricter, more devout England, they were silenced as well, imprisoned, banished, executed. The Queen had no patience for zeal that did not originate from her. Whether your cross was gold or plain, whether you knelt or stood, whether you whispered Latin or English, it did not matter. If it did not come from her mouth, it was wrong. Even the act of silence became suspect. Those who said nothing at all were watched closely. Because in Elizabeth's world, neutrality was not innocence. It was defiance in disguise. She demanded public performance, the genuflection, the attendance, the recitation. You could believe what you wanted, as long as no one ever knew it. This duality, the private faith and the public lie, wore people down. It divided families. A father might outwardly conform while his daughter held forbidden beliefs. A wife might whisper Hail Marys at night while her husband preached obedience by day. And still, they had to smile. Still, they had to play their parts. The Queen had turned religion into theatre, and every soul in England had become an actor in a play they never agreed to perform. But behind this iron grip on faith was the same ghost that haunted all of Elizabeth's policies: fear. She had seen what religion could do. Her sister, Mary, had ruled with fire and gallows, burning Protestants by the hundreds in a holy purge that left England reeling. The sight of charred bodies, the scent of smoke on the wind, it had seared itself into the collective memory of the realm. Elizabeth promised she would be different. And in her mind, she was. She offered no bonfires, no autodafé, only silence, only law, only quiet ruin. But silence can be a deeper cruelty than fire. A child who watches their priest vanish, a mother who buries her beads in the garden, a grandfather who forgets and says grace the old way and is never seen again. These are not flames. These are absences. Holes where people used to be. And England under Elizabeth learned to live with holes. Her control was so absolute that even the architecture changed. Hidden compartments, priest holes, were built into the homes of those who resisted. Tiny spaces, no larger than coffins, where priests would crouch for hours, sometimes days, without light or air, waiting for the Queen's hunters to pass. Some died in those spaces. Their bones still found centuries later behind walls. Not martyrs, not traitors, just men who believed differently. And still, Elizabeth held her court, danced, smiled, rode through cheering crowds. The people loved her, because what choice did they have? She was England. She had made herself into the body of the state, the soul of the nation. To question her was to question the ground beneath your feet. And so, the people sang songs in her honor, even as their churches changed shape. They raised cups in her name, even as their neighbors vanished. They named their daughters after her, even as their fathers were fined for praying wrong. This is the genius of her terror. It left no marks, no flames, only a silence that grew deeper with every year. A silence so profound it passed itself on to the next generation. Like a prayer, no one dared say aloud. Elizabeth ruled not through violence, but through the fear of what violence had already done. She knew that the memory of fire can burn longer than the fire itself, and so she offered her people a choice: obedience or oblivion. They chose obedience, and the silence reigned. There comes a time in every reign when the crown begins to grow heavy, not with gold, not with duty, but with the weight of time. For Elizabeth I, that moment did not arrive gently. It came like erosion, quiet, slow, but utterly unstoppable. She had outlived lovers, rivals, queens and kings. But there was one enemy she could not command. One adversary she could not imprison: age. In a court ruled by image, where divine right was painted onto skin and majesty measured by appearance, Elizabeth's greatest fear was not betrayal or invasion. It was decay, the slow unraveling of flesh, the betrayal of her own body. And so she fought it not with medicine, not with surrender, but with theatre. She crafted an illusion so complete that even her closest courtiers were forced to pretend. She was ageless. She was flawless. She was eternal. But behind the doors of her private chambers, the truth grew harder to conceal. The white lead makeup that had once been her salvation now clung to her face like a second skin, cracking with every movement. It seeped into her pores, poisoned her blood, and turned her once vibrant complexion into a brittle mask. Beneath it, her real skin broke and bled. Still, she painted over it again, and again, and again. She could not stop. Ash morning, the ritual became more elaborate. The rouge grew darker, the white thicker, the wigs taller, heavier. What was once enhancement became concealment, and what was once concealment became delusion. Her teeth, blackened and rotting, were padded with cloth to give her cheeks the appearance of youth. Her hands, once delicate and expressive, grew spotted and stiff. She hid them in gloves. Her waist, once the envy of Europe, was cinched into armor-like bodices that stole her breath but preserved the silhouette. She wore dresses so stiff and so towering that she needed help to sit, to walk, to breathe. She was not a queen. She was a construct. But what was truly disturbing, what terrified those who served her most, was not the makeup, or the wigs, or the painted lies. It was how completely she believed them. She no longer allowed mirrors in her chambers. Only selected attendants were permitted to help her dress, and even they were forbidden from commenting on her appearance. To speak the truth was not only impolite, it was dangerous. Even the suggestion of her aging could be construed as treason. The court adapted. They learned the new language of denial. When her hands trembled, they spoke of grace. When her voice grew hoarse, they praised its depth. When her smile revealed empty gums, they bowed deeper. The performance was not hers alone. It belonged to the entire nation. And yet, behind closed doors, the signs were undeniable. Her health faltered. She suffered from headaches, dizziness, fatigue that left her bedridden for days. Her memory slipped. Her temper flared with increasing intensity. The mask began to crack, not just physically, but politically. But still, she would not rest. Still, she would not admit defeat. She stood for hours at court. Even when her legs failed her, she held audiences with ambassadors. Even as her hearing faded, she rode in processions wrapped in furs. Even as her body grew colder and her mind more distant, her people cheered, not because they believed, but because they feared what would happen if they stopped. And yet, all the while, something inside her knew. She knew she was not the woman the world saw. She knew the portrait no longer matched the face beneath. But to admit it, to speak it aloud, would be to let the crown slip. And Elizabeth had never allowed anything to slip. Not once. So she clung harder. She refused to name a successor. Even as her body withered, even as her court begged her for clarity, for security, for guidance, she gave none. To speak of succession was to speak of death, and she would not die. Not yet. Not ever. The kingdom waited in quiet terror, behind every curtain. Whispers swirled. Would civil war follow? Would the Scots invade? Would Parliament fracture? No one knew. Because the Queen refused to prepare. She was eternal. Planning for her death would be admitting that she was mortal. And that was a truth she had long since buried beneath powder and pearl. Those last years were not a reign. They were a haunting. She moved through the halls like a spectre, heavily painted, heavily costumed, but lighter in presence than ever before. Her laugh, once sharp and commanding, became brittle and delayed. Her gaze, once cutting, drifted and returned only with effort. Courtiers spoke of the chill that followed her, as if she brought winter with her wherever she went. And then she began to disappear. Not all at once, not dramatically, but subtly. She stopped attending council, then court, then chapel. She would sit in silence for hours, refusing food, refusing sleep, wrapped in heavy robes, refusing even to lie down. No one could persuade her to rest. She would not remove her robes. She would not remove the wig. She would not remove the crown. She sat in the twilight of her chambers like a painted statue of herself, as if she believed that motionlessness could preserve her. And in a way, it did, because when she finally died in the spring of the year 1603, she left behind no disheveled corpse, no exposed truth. She left behind the image she had so meticulously protected. The last people to see her alive carried with them not the vision of a dying woman, but of a queen still seated, still painted, still watching. No successor had been named, but James of Scotland would soon take the throne. Her body was taken to rest. and her court exhaled. And in that exhale, something collapsed, something no one dared name. Because even in death, Elizabeth controlled the narrative. She did not allow the world to see her fall. Her portraits remained untouched. Her name, unsullied. Her image, immortal. But for those who had stood beside her, who had watched her decline in silence, the truth remained. The woman who demanded perfection had become its prisoner. The queen who built herself into a god had died, unable to acknowledge her humanity. She left behind a kingdom stable but scarred, a people proud but worn, a legacy golden but cracked beneath the surface. And behind it all, she left a lesson too painful to speak aloud. When power demands perfection, it consumes the very soul that wields it. And Elizabeth, the great virgin queen, was devoured not by war, nor betrayal, nor treason, but by the very illusion she refused to let go. As the winter of her reign deepened, so too did the silence that surrounded her. It was no longer the quiet of majesty, of reverence, or even of fear. It was the kind of silence that grows when an entire kingdom holds its breath and dares not exhale. For Elizabeth I, the silence had always been useful. It was her shield, her weapon, her curtain drawn between image and decay. But now, that silence had become something else, something dangerous. It had become a void, and into that void, every fear of England's future began to pour. For nearly 45 years, she had ruled alone. No husband, not child, no heir. The Virgin Queen had claimed to be wedded to England itself. But time, relentless as it is, cared nothing for poetry. Time asked the question. No courtier dared speak aloud. What happens when the bride of England dies? And she was dying. The signs were no longer hidden. They were everywhere in the days she spent secluded, in the public appearances that ceased without notice, in the letters that went unanswered, in the orders that never came. Those closest to her saw it first: the weight loss, the fits of melancholy, the refusal to eat or sleep or change her clothes. She no longer ruled, she only lingered. And still she named no successor. It is difficult to understand today just how terrifying that was. In the absence of a named heir, the future of the realm stood suspended above a precipice. There were whispers of civil war, of foreign intervention, of uprisings, of Scotland marching south, of Spain seeing its moment at last, of rival claimants sharpening their daggers beneath velvet gloves. And at the centre of this storm stood a woman who refused to acknowledge that the end had come. Her counsel begged her. Her most trusted advisers pleaded in coded words and cautious glances. James of Scotland was the clear choice, the sensible choice, the only choice. He was Protestant. He had Tudor blood. He had long been groomed by allies in England to take the crown without conflict. But Elizabeth would not say his name. Not even once. It was not pride. It was not spite. It was fear. To speak of succession was to speak of death. And Elizabeth, for all her cleverness, had spent her life avoiding that one truth. She had no son to carry on her name. No daughter to whisper to in the final hours. Her bloodline ended with her. And what she left behind was not a family but a myth. And a myth, once questioned, crumbled quickly. She had built herself into England. She had become a living emblem, a banner of unity that fluttered even as her body failed. If she admitted that the end had come, would the nation fall with her? So she remained silent, and England faithful. Frightened England waited. Some began to prepare in secret. Ambassadors from Scotland sent cautious messages to allies in the Privy Council. The Cecils, father and son, maneuvered behind the curtain, drawing up plans to welcome James the moment the Queen passed. Others began to make peace with old enemies. Military commanders quietly positioned their men. Nobles counted their allies and weighed their loyalties. And all the while, Elizabeth sat alone in her darkening rooms, refusing to lie down, refusing to change her robes, refusing to remove the wig that had become part of her skull. They say she stood for days, that she would not be moved, that she stared into space and whispered to no one, that she waved away food, that she turned her face to the wall, that she would not die because she did not permit herself to die. The image of her final days is not one of grandeur. It is one of suspension, like a cracked portrait hung too long on the wall, still commanding awe, but trembling in its frame, and while she lingered, the country's nerves began to fray. London merchants feared trade disruption. Religious leaders feared a return to Catholic persecution. The navy feared a northern invasion. The nobility feared one another. All feared the silence that echoed from the palace. It was a silence full of ghosts, Mary, Queen of Scots, beheaded but not forgotten. Lady Jane Grey. 9 days of tragedy. The Wars of the Roses. Not so distant after all. England had been here before. They had seen what happens when succession is unclear, when ambition outpaces loyalty, when the sword becomes the only voice of law. And now, once more, the realm stood on the edge of that same darkness, and the only woman who could prevent it refused to speak. Some claimed she had gone mad. That grief for her lost companions had turned her inward. Others whispered of poison, of divine punishment, of a curse passed from Anne Boleyn's blood to her daughter's veins. But most said nothing. Most simply watched and waited. And then she died on a cold March morning in the year 1603, without proclamation, without procession, without an heir declared in her own voice. The Queen of England slipped from this world into history. She left no final speech, no last gesture, no blessing, just silence. It was James who acted quickly. Within hours, he was proclaimed King of England. Messengers galloped north. Plans, long prepared in secret, were unfurled in daylight. The succession, against all fears, was peaceful. But that peace came not from Elizabeth's planning. It came from those who had prepared for her refusal. And so the Virgin Queen was buried with all the pomp and ceremony her court could muster. The golden coffin, the weeping nobles, the ringing bells, the black horses, the hushed crowds. England mourned, but beneath the mourning was a breath held far too long, a breath they could finally release, because the crown at last had passed, and the kingdom, though scarred and shaken, endured. But even as James took the throne, even as the new era began, something lingered in the rooms she left behind. Something cold, something heavy, something that no crown could carry. Because Elizabeth had not left quietly, she had not passed the torch. She had extinguished herself. And in doing so, she left England not with legacy, but with a question. What happens to a kingdom when its queen becomes a myth, and the myth cannot die? They buried her with majesty, with silence, and with a lie. The lie wore white lead and crimson velvet. The lie sat beneath golden canopies and posed in painted portraits. The lie was written into sermons and woven into tapestries. It was sung by choirs, etched into stone, and pressed into the minds of generations not yet born. The lie was that Elizabeth I had been eternal, beautiful, unshakable, flawless, beloved. The lie was that she had died exactly as she had lived, wise, strong, godlike. But those who had watched her unravel knew otherwise. They knew that the queen who now lay in state had once refused to lie down at all. had stood for days in the same gown, her mind flickering like a dying candle, whispering to the shadows, refusing food, refusing comfort, refusing truth. They knew that she had not smiled in months, that her hands shook when she reached for her goblet, that she had stopped reading, stopped signing, stopped speaking, and still, they painted her resting face as peaceful. Still, they carried her image into the streets as if she had been untouched by death, because the story of Elizabeth could not end in weakness, not after so many years of performance, not after she had turned her own face into propaganda, not after she had sacrificed her body, her mind, her peace, to become the symbol England needed. If she died as a woman, then the myth died too. So they buried the woman and preserved the mask. The painters returned to their canvases. They gave her perfect skin, hair like fire, eyes that saw everything. They painted her as Estrella, the virgin goddess, descended from heaven to bring justice. They painted her as Gloriana, fairy queen of a golden land. They painted her as an eternal flame, a beacon of English greatness, a mother who needed no child, because the realm itself had sprung from her womb, and the lie flourished. James, now king of both Scotland and England. I had no reason to shatter the illusion. He needed stability, continuity. The people needed to believe that the crown had passed gently from divinity to divinity. So he let them worship her memory. He let the Elizabethan age crystallize into legend. He let the historians sharpen her outline, buff away the cracks, gloss over the terror and loneliness and poison. He let her become perfect. But perfection is a lie that demands a cost, and the cost was memory. What the people no longer remembered was the woman who had ruled from the shadows of trauma, the woman who, as a child, had been declared illegitimate, who had seen her mother executed, her stepmothers vanish one by one, her own life placed in constant peril. They forgot the prisoner in the tower. They forgot the young queen trembling as rebellion rose. They forgot the fear behind the eyes of the girl who had survived by trusting no one. They forgot how much it cost her to be strong. They forgot that the Virgin Queen bled. The lie made her unbreakable, but it also made her unreachable. For centuries, she became not a sovereign to be studied, but a saint to be adored. No longer a human being, but an emblem embroidered on banners, a stylized initial carved into iron gates, a myth sealed beneath layers of romantic fog. Even her tyranny became charm, her cruelty reframed as wit, her silence praised as wisdom. It was easier that way, because the truth of Elizabeth was too sharp, too complicated, too real. She had ruled a court of silence, but her reign was loud with pain. She had banned love, but longed to be loved. She had poisoned herself with makeup and forced others to do the same. She had smiled as she exiled, as she executed, as she turned her own likeness into law. She had taken every part of herself that was human and burned it at the altar of monarchy. And now, in death, she had done it again. The woman was gone. Only the legend remained. And so England moved on. The Stuart era began. The chambers were cleaned, the portraits dusted, her signature sealed in glass. The past was preserved, but not remembered, not truly, for memory requires truth, and truth was something Elizabeth had spent her whole life hiding. But still, the lie holds. Tourists walk through her palaces and call her great. Students recite her speeches and marvel at her resolve. Her name is spoken with reverence. Her image printed on cups and coins and costumes. Few speak of the white paste that ate through her skin. Few speak of the women she exiled for marrying. Few speak of the teeth that fell from her mouth, or the priests who died in silence, or the court that lived in constant fear of her changing moods. Few speak of the night she died, standing, refusing to surrender her body to the truth, because myths are easier than people, and Elizabeth had given England exactly what it wanted: a goddess instead of a girl, a monument instead of a monarch, a lit so grand, so beautiful, so enduring that no one dares tell the truth anymore. Not even history. And now, the court is empty. The candles have long since burned out. The great tapestries that once lined the walls of Whitehall now hang in stillness. There is no music echoing through the galleries. No gowns sweeping along marble floors. No voices rehearsing the lines of courtly love or cautious loyalty. The Queen is gone. The doors are closed. And what remains is not just memory, but something colder, quieter, heavier. It is silence. Not the silence of peace. Not the kind that settles after triumph, but the kind that lingers after a storm, after years of performance, when all the actors have left the stage and the painted mask is placed back in its box. The kind of silence that carries weight, like a secret still alive in the walls. The kind of silence that breathes. She was called many things in her time. The Virgin Queen, Gloriana, the Phoenix, the mother of her people, the daughter of destiny. But in truth, if there was one title she earned above all others, it was the Queen of Silence. She did not raise her voice often. She did not need to. Her disapproval could ruin. Her absence could punish. Her gaze alone could strip titles from men who had once dined at her side. And so she reigned not through noise, but through restraint, through 1,000 unspoken rules, 1,000 unshed tears, 1,000 unspoken names she dared not remember aloud. Even in childhood, she learned that silence was the only safe companion. When her mother, Anna Boleyn, was taken and beheaded, no one explained it to her. No one held her. No one answered her questions. They simply removed the woman from her life, erased her name from official records, and expected Elizabeth to smile. And so she did. Quietly, obediently. She watched and waited and understood that love could be fatal and truth could be treason. As a girl, she was shuffled through households, given books, denied affection. When her sister Mary imprisoned her in the Tower of London, she did not protest. She survived by speaking carefully, cautiously, always between the lines. She emerged not softened by suffering, but sharpened by it. She had learned that words could be weapons, and silence, when wielded properly, could be far more powerful than any blade. And when she became queen, she brought that silence with her. She ruled for 45 years, a lifetime, and yet how little she truly said. She made great speeches. Yes, crafted, inspiring, legendary, but they were performances, perfected down to the final syllable. Off the stage, she gave little. Her heart remained sealed. Her thoughts, buried beneath layers of calculation. No one ever truly knew her. That was the point. She never married, never named a successor, never wrote a confession,
Now that the lights
never
have
shared her
dimmed
final words.
and the palace has fallen
When those around her
quiet,
died, friends, advisors, companions, she grieved in private. If at all, she offered no eulogies. She simply continued, silent. And so it is perhaps fitting that in the end, she left her people with the same gift she had given them all her life. Silence. But now, in this stillness, we are allowed to feel what they could not. We are allowed to ask the questions her court dared not raise. What did she whisper to herself in those last days, seated on the cold cushions of her chamber, refusing to lie down? Whose name did she think of, but refused to speak? Did she wonder where the child inside her had gone? Did she miss the mother she never had the chance to mourn? Did she imagine, for even a moment, what her life might have been if she had not chosen the crown, or had the crown chosen her? We cannot know, because she would never tell us. All we have are fragments letters that reveal little, portraits that lie, myths that glow too brightly to be trusted, and the silence, always the silence. But here, as night falls and the past curls around us like smoke, we can admit something soft, something true. She did not live an easy life, nor a peaceful one. She bore the weight of a kingdom, the expectations of a legacy, the shame of her bloodline, the ghosts of 6 dead stepmothers, the hatred of popes, the ambition of men, the loneliness of power, and still, she stood. Still, she smiled. Still, she carried it all. And perhaps, in doing so, she gave us something, not just a golden age, but a mirror, a reflection of what it means to hold everything inside for the sake of duty, to become what the world demands, even if it costs you yourself. Elizabeth I was not just a queen. She was a woman who turned silence into survival, fear into fire, scars into sovereignty, and when the time came, she did not scream. She did not collapse. She slipped into death the way she had lived her life. Upright, unmoving, unspeaking, and somewhere, far beneath the earth, beyond the marble tomb and golden lettering, beyond the velvet that covers her bones, the silence continues. It is not empty. It remembers, and it reigns